I am a second year, technically a third year if you count credits, but it's too, I don't feel like getting into that. Currently, I am number one on the leaderboard for this like challenges we do every week. Shout out to Tenchi, who's right behind me, and the only reason I'm ahead is because he felt sick one week. Besides RIT-Sec, I'm a member of Crew, which is a Christian club on campus. I did a minor internship last summer. I did both IR-Secs as black team and as a blue teamer, and I'm a part of RVAP and WESIS. Show up for WESIS on Tuesday nights and RVAP on Thursdays. So, get into this. Just what is a honeypot? A honeypot is a system or device that mimics a likely target of an attack and then distracts or deflects an attacker so that researchers can study them. This is a piece of what we like to call deception technology. I will get more into what deception technology is later in the presentation, but for now, that's all you need to know. Honeypots were kind of created to follow the term it's easier to attract flies with honey rather than vinegar. Using a honeypot, you would draw an attacker to yourself and then be able to study their techniques, behaviors, and so on. So, our honeypot was a cowrie honeypot, which focused on SSH and telnet connections. It would log and monitor any that came into the device. And yeah, it's really good. So here's a simple rundown of what we did. First, we were all given an AWS server, our own personal one to log into with our SSH keys. And then we would set up the basic security measures, like, not a default password. And we would switch SSH off of port 22 to a random port. We chose like 2000 something. After that, we would set up the Docker container on the port 22 where SSH was originally, because that's SSH default port. And then on top of the container, we set up the cowrie honeypot. After that, it was a simple waiting game. After a bit, we downloaded the logs, wrote a Python script to analyze the massive amount of data we collected, and then graph the results, which is what you're about to see. Now, the data we ended up breaking down into 3 sections. The first was the IP address, the username, the second is the username, and third is the password. We were trying to study both the origin of the attackers, and then the credentials they attempted when trying to log in. So first and foremost is the IP address. The most common IP address is 5.188.86.173. This appeared around 12,000 times in the logs. When researching this, the results were slightly inconclusive. I went through many geolocation applications and programs and stuff like that to try to find the country of origin. However, I received mixed results. The main 2, as you can see, that I found were the Netherlands and Ireland. Again, most of the results actually turned up with the Netherlands. However, Ireland was another possible candidate. This can mean a plethora of things, though I have neither the expertise nor the knowledge to really get into it. So here's the graph I was talking about earlier. From what I've noticed of the data here, it seems to follow a simple rule. A few have a lot and a lot have a few. As in, you can see a few IP addresses had a lot of attempts and a lot of appearances in the log, and a lot of the IP addresses had a few attempts. Now, this may seem like they only appeared once or twice, and while these aren't all the IP addresses, the real fact of the matter is the number of times these other addresses appeared in logs was just found insignificant compared to the ones that appeared a lot. So the most common username was root, as you can guess why. It appeared around 57,000 times in our logs. Now, as you all know, root is the super user on Linux, so it's kind of obvious why someone would want to log in as him. As Cartman is saying, as the root user, you can pretty much do anything you want. Once again, like with the previous graph, most of the attempts were to try to log into the root as the root user. And once again, just note, it may seem that these usernames were used maybe once or twice. However, it's just hard to tell because of how drastic a difference there is between root and the next one. As you can see, there's some obvious ones like admin, Ubuntu, Debian, MySQL, Oracle. All these are similar to default usernames or for different services or just accounts. So, and default credentials is something I will get into later. Last but not least is the most common password, which is admin. I have seen this a couple of times. I can't remember if it was in challenges or CTFs, just admin. Don't do that. Just, it's a very common default password, which is an issue, but that's another story. And similar to root, this appeared around 57,000 times in our logs. I cannot see if anybody's asking any questions, so sorry about that. I will check at the end. Once again, the top result is still significantly more popular than the rest. The other ones are almost deemed insignificant by the graph. I do want to note, if you might notice in the middle here, it says love. That was me when testing out the initial, like to see if the logging was going on correctly. But otherwise, you can see there were a lot of different types of passwords attempted. So, as you know, Cowrie isn't the only type of honeypot, and there were others. Yes, of course. As you can see, there is the GHH honeypot, which was something we looked into, and the Minecraft honeypot. We just kind of picked what looked cool, but in the end, the group was up for anything. We settled with Cowrie because of its simplicity and the guarantee that we would actually get some data from it. So, what did we learn? Part one is this is like my freshman year, first semester. I didn't really know anything, so I appreciated all the knowledge. First thing I learned was how to use keys with SSH, which is something I'm actually doing now in my network servicing class. So getting the pre-exposure was nice. As obviously, keys are superior to passwords. They're just harder to brute force and kind of harder to obtain. And also, key usage is very common in just the real world and in your classes. So it's a good thing to get used to doing. Another thing was just being able to monitor an additional project. Well, I mentioned before, I had an internship over the summer, and that was actually one of the things I had to do. I had two main projects, and while working on the one, I couldn't just switch back and forth every second, but I kept tabs to keep note on the other projects, but not enough to really steal away my focus, but just enough to make sure everything was up and running nice. So it is a good experience to have to be able to, while working on one thing, keep track of other things while not having to really interact with it. Because all I had to do was check in on the log to see if it was still recording. Another thing I learned was how to sort through and analyze a massive amount of data. Again, this came in quite in handy during my internship where I had to do a research project. I had to comb through so many pages of documentation, websites, and white papers. So being able to pick out patterns of behavior and terms and information I need like that is a very useful skill. On top of that, as I mentioned before, I made a Python script specifically to analyze this type of data in a CSV file, which I will discuss later. But as kind of touching on what Emmanuel was saying earlier, personal tool creation is a very useful skill depending on where you go. So even though I know it's a script, I don't want to get into that with anybody. I know it might be the wrong terminology. I know I used something earlier like that in my Medium 2 presentation, but you get what you understand what I'm trying to say. Oh, there we go. So yeah, here's the Python script thing. I thought it was later. So I ended up just adapting some of my old code from a different project I worked on to do this. And basically what it did was it would split up the CSV file into 3 lists: the IP addresses, the passwords, and the usernames. Then those lists were fed into a counter, which after it found a certain entry, it would then go through and remove all other instances of that entry, including the one I just found. So as you can see here, E is the item at the beginning. Then it would count using the list function, which was really nice to have and not have to loop through. And then remove all, loops through, removes every instance, including the one you were just saved-ish. And then it would put it all in a dictionary. That's why each one had a key, and the key with the key being the actual IP address, username, password, and the value being the number of times it appeared. So back to what I learned. Another thing I learned was basic bash. As an itty bitty freshman, I knew no bash whatsoever and barely any experience with Linux, and we do a lot with Linux. So learning some of this stuff and having someone coach me through it was very helpful, like using pipes, using grep, using cut. It was just a nice way to ease into it and actually have it being applicable right away. And like I was just saying, Linux is very prevalent in this field, so bash knowledge is extremely useful. I also learned how to set up the Docker container and calorie on the system. Now, the most important part about this with what I learned is that sometimes you need to know something like a new tool only for a specific problem you're having. You may use it later. I wouldn't be able to do all the Docker stuff and calorie stuff like off the top of my head right here and now. So unfortunately, so no demo. But I was able to learn it and be able to use it effectively and efficiently during that time. And that's again, another useful skill to have, is just having something for the current situation. Could I relearn it? Yeah, but don't need it at the moment. And as I mentioned before, honeypots are a piece of deception technology. And I love being able to work with deception stuff. I had attended a conference at MITRE over the summer, and they did a presentation on deception as a field. Now, as I was saying, deception is a kind of subfield of cybersecurity, and it is completely fascinating. I would highly recommend you spend some time, go up, look into it, like Google something about it. It's a very fascinating subject, and I can do it no justice with the amount of time I'm dedicating to this presentation. Trust me, I could do a whole another 2-3 presentations purely on deception technology, but this is about the honeypot for now. Last but not least, as I've been mentioning all throughout this presentation, default credentials are a major issue. As you can see through the data, a lot of the stuff attempted were default credentials. And this is just speaking from my personal experience. The reason a lot of people attempt to do something like this a lot of times is because it's worked before. And to quote a source, which I link later in the presentation, default credentials are a huge contributor to security breaches. So don't just take my word for it. So some fun facts. One, the reason we capped out at around 57,000 log entries is because the server crashed, or the Docker container crashed. We can't remember exactly, but basically we couldn't access it anymore. It just kind of shut down, and we just took what we could get out of there, which was the 57,000 attempts. It was kind of funny. It was like a week or two in, the bots just kind of killed it. Secondly, some of these attackers were actually kind of creative. Like, apparently somebody thought we might be the company called Langineers. Not even joking, real place, real company, amazing people. And so they tried to make a custom password based off of the name Langineers. As you can see here, there's the A being replaced with the caret, I's with the exclamations, E's with 30s. It's kind of cute. Last thing I noticed, and this was actually a notice while preparing this presentation again, was that the most common IP addresses, as you can see here, actually all seem to belong to maybe the same network or subnet. So possibly it could be part of a botnet. And we were looking into SSH bots, so wouldn't it be surprising? But I just found it interesting that this little subsection were very popular in the logs. Now, as I mentioned before, all the research I did into this, including links to the other honeypots and things like that, are all right here in case you might be interested might be interested in looking into this more or just checking to see if I'm not just, you know, lying my butt off to save myself. There's 2 pages here, including a lot of the IP location, geolocation stuff I used. Now, are there any questions? I'll switch over to this, stop sharing, switch over to the stream. Loud, yeah, I know the graphs are horrible. Is there anything I wished that your mentorships group touched on or went deeper into looking back? Honestly, I thought it was kind of perfect as it was. Like I said, when I first started here, I didn't really know much. So diving in too deep might have felt a little bit overwhelming. But I loved how, I mean, could we have talked more about the different honeypots and these results, like to analyze them as a group? Maybe. But I found that it was an amazing experience that I wouldn't trade for the world. I forgot you can't talk on here still.